In this video, we'll see the basic authentication and authorization flow in various scenarios, along with the understanding of basic naming conventions and also some basic architectures used in here. So in the authentication and authorization process, we'll have three different applications or servers. A resource requester, I have named it as a resource requester. We'll see in a while why it can be called as client. And the resource requester sends a request to the resource server to fetch some data or the information from the resource server. The resource server wants to give the information only to permitted users or the permitted requests. What resource server does is it asks the authentication server to make sure that every request coming from the resource requester is authenticated and authorized. We'll see only the success scenarios over here in this sequence diagram. The examples of resource requesters are UI application, for example, the Angular application or the Postman or client server, and also it can be a Swagger user interface. Authentication servers can be a keycloak or Okta, or also you can write your own Spring Boot authentication server. In our further videos, we will use keycloak as the authentication server. The resource server is your actual application which needs the security to make sure that the authentication and authorization is configured. Your application in any of the frameworks, I'm going to explain using Spring Boot as well as the Quarkus application. The first thing what happens here is the resource requester sends request to get the authentication token from the authentication server. The request contains the credentials which are needed for the request to be authenticated. Once the authentication server validates the request and says you are successfully authenticated, it sends a token to the resource requester. And then the resource requester sends the request to the resource server along with the token provided by the authentication server. When the resource server receives this request, the resource server says, let me first validate your token, or let me first validate your request. The resource server sends a request to the authentication server saying, please validate this token. And once the authentication server validates the token, it sends the response back to the resource server saying this request is validated and you can provide the information to the requester. The resource server sends the information or the data requested by the resource requester. In this sequence diagram, we have seen three main communications. We'll now see individually and try to understand the naming conventions over here. The first communication was between resource requester and the authentication server. Since the resource requester is requesting to the authentication server in a client server architecture, it becomes a client and authentication server is the server. When you're using keycloak and you want to use the login configuration using the user interface and not the REST API, then you need to add a client configuration in the keycloak server. Another set of communication was between the resource requester and the resource server. Here, the resource requester acts as a client and resource server acts as a server in a client-server architecture. So in both the communication, resource requester is a client over here. And in the third set of communication, the resource server becomes a client and authentication server becomes a server in a client-server architecture. And you need to add a client configuration in the keycloak since the resource server is a client to the authentication server. From these three set of communications, we have seen that resource requester is client whenever it is communicating between the authentication server or the resource server. Hence, instead of calling this as resource requester, we can call it as client. This architecture can be used whenever a client is a UI application like Angular application or a Postman. And hence, I can name this as UI application or the Postman in the client side. If the client here is a client server, what a client server mean here is, if you see over here, the client server is another application, a backend application, which serves to another front-end application or the Postman, and also it interacts with the another resource server. So the third architecture would look like this when you are using your resource server itself as the UI for testing. Usually what happens is whenever you're implementing a backend application and you have an independent front-end application being developed, you want to test your REST APIs using the Swagger UI, and this Swagger UI can be added to your application using some libraries. And if you're using Spring Boot 3.0 plus, then you can use this Spring Doc OpenAPI Starter Web MVC UI. If you're using a Spring Boot application less than 3.0, then you can use Spring Doc OpenAPI UI. And if you're using Quarkus, you can use Quarkus Smallray OpenAPI. So since I'm explaining using both the Quarkus as well as Spring Boot, I'll be using these two libraries. And also, since we will see the explanation using the Postman as well as the Swagger, the first set of architecture and this architecture will be relevant to us. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.